Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. And once again, we thank Yah, the Most High Yah, for his wonderful Shabbat, his holy day, a day we love and delight ourselves in. We thank you all for joining us today, the House of Shiloh Ministries, on the lesson that it sponsors, but now what to do after you learn the truth. And this is presented by yours truly, Brother Andrew Bradley. We are in part 6, and we're going to continue with talking on how Torah and covenant are eternal. And we're in the New Testament proving that the Torah and the covenant are relevant, especially in the acts of our Messiah. And now we're going to talk to his disciples. So let's go ahead and get started. It's a small verse. I'm going to start off reading once again. Acts 2:1, where we're going to figure out, what did the disciples do? Did they obey Torah? Did they obey the covenant? Did they adhere to the covenant and obey the Torah? Let's see. In Acts 2:1, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. Now, the church teaches that the Pentecost was what, an event? The way it looks like, the way I recall it being taught, that this day was an event that occurred, or a marker of a special event. But they don't teach it what it truly means. And Pentecost is from the Greek word Pentecoste, which is the 50th day from Passover. Mm-hmm. This is the Feast of Pentecost, known in Torah as the Feast of Weeks. And you'll find this in Exodus 34:22 through 23. So if after the Messiah's death, and we already showed in part 5 that the Messiah did the holy days, he even dressed according to Torah, and he did Sabbath. And now we're seeing that the disciples were adhering to a feast day in Torah. So why, after the death of the Messiah, the apostles would be celebrating the Feast of Weeks? They didn't get the memo that the Torah was nailed to the cross. They didn't get that note that the church loves to sell. That's why it's important not to let yourself stay in ignorance, because you need to know what that word Pentecost means. Mm-hmm. Does anybody want to add anything to this?
Small commentary. and that is this. Right. If they are observing the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Shavuot, then that means that they already observe the Feast of Pesach and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So they would not be doing this particular feast of Pentecost, if they had not done the other ones previously. That means they're keeping time. They're keeping up with not the tradition, but with the commandments to observe the feast, to keep the Sabbaths. The feast days are considered Sabbaths. They are considered Sabbaths. Just as the 7th day is considered a Sabbath, the feast days are considered Sabbaths also. So we're supposed to keep all of his Sabbaths. And the disciples are carrying that out. They're still continuing to do what they were taught to do, even after his death. So this is a continuation of what they started when Feast of Passover took place. Because if you remember, during Feast of Passover, or Pesach, this was during the crucifixion. That's what the crucifixion is about, right? And now here we are, days after this, a month or two afterwards, and now they're celebrating the Feast of Pentecost. So they're continuing to carry on the mindset that Yahushua taught them before he died. Okay, thank you, Brother Andrew.
No, thank you. Thank you. That's a good point. Yeah, well, because we know that the Feast of Weeks comes after Passover and Unleavened Bread. That's right. So they've already done 3 holy. Now this is the 3rd holy day, 3rd feast day.
Yes.
High holy days.
Correct.
So, all righty. Anybody else?
That's it.
All right. I believe it's Brother David turn to read on the next slide for us.
Now when Paul and his company loosed from Phaeus, they came to Is that right? Paphos. I'm sorry. They came to Perga and Ptolemais, and John departing from them returned to Jerusalem. But when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch. In Pisa, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down.
All right, thank you, brother. So here, I like to point this one out because here's Paul practicing the Sabbath. Again, a commandment of Torah. And this is Paul, the very one they tried to accuse of writing the law away, teaching that the law is no more. So I just wanted to point that verse out to everyone that's in the audience, that the man that they constantly say, oh, he's teaching that the law is no longer needed. If that was the case, then why would Paul practice it himself? Okay? All righty. We can move to the next slide here. And Minister Ronnie, are you available to read?
Excuse me.
Yes, I am.
Please read those 2 sentences.
Okay. Acts 13 through 14. Now when Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, they came to Perga and
I'm sorry, let me interrupt you. That might be a repeat, right, from the last one? Is that the previous slide one too? I think so. I don't want to. Yeah. Don't read the top one. Read that bottom one for me.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now when they had passed through Ephesus and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, which was the synagogue of the Jews, and Paul and his manner were into them. And 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the city.
Okay, all right. Sorry about the confusion there. But here's Paul again practicing the Sabbath, and it was always the norm to go into the synagogues on the Sabbath to read Torah and to learn. The Messiah did it, the disciples did it, and Paul continued to do so as well. And he did it 3 Sabbath days, 3 weeks in a row he did this. Now, I'm not saying he didn't talk to them throughout the week, going out and speaking to them and all that. But when it comes to the Sabbath, he practiced it in obedience. Because if he didn't, why is it being mentioned here? What's the relevance of saying it? You don't even have to say it. Why couldn't they just say Paul met with them on Wednesday and Tuesday for the last couple of weeks? Why do they mention the Sabbath? It's not like you can't see these guys. They don't just disappear after the Sabbath. Now, we know that there's also a benefit of going on Sabbath. Guess what? That's where the Hebrews are going to be. In the synagogue, obeying the Sabbath. But that doesn't mean he couldn't have spoken to them at any other time. So the point I'm making is this, is that the scriptures purposely mentioned the Sabbath to demonstrate that it was being obeyed. It did not have to be mentioned as here. It just simply, all he had to say here was Paul spoke with them as his manner. He didn't have to say on the Sabbath day. The point is, the scripture points out that the Sabbath was being obeyed, and Paul was the one doing it here. We don't think like that. It wasn't even necessary to mention the Sabbath day in this verse, but it did. Anybody has anything to add to this or to this?
I think the writer, not the writer, I would say the writer actually highlighted that this is the custom of Paul, because it's almost implied that there was going to be a challenge about Paul teaching on Shabbat, and that they could potentially say the reason Paul taught on Shabbat is because the Hebrews happened to be there on the Shabbat. So that's why he was there. But when they add in this phrase, as his manner was, that's personal. That's telling you this is something that he chooses to do. So I think that is just pointing out that this was Paul's manner to do this. And bear in mind, Paul was not one of the 12 disciples, right? So now you see Torah or the commandments of Yah being obeyed beyond the 12 disciples, even after the death of Messiah. Thank you, Brother Andrew.
Oh, no, that's a great point. And we're about to build on that on the next slide. Brother, go ahead and read that for me, please. I'm picking on Paul, and I did it on purpose. Keep picking on Paul, especially since Paul's 13 letters are in the Bible. He makes up most of the New Testament. So it's easy to pick on Paul, but please go ahead, brother.
No problem. And Paul, after this, tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head, and Centuria, for he had a vow, and he came to Ephesus, and left them there. But he himself entered into the synagogue, and reasoned with the Jews. When they desired him to tarry longer with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you, if Yah willing. And he sailed from Ephesus.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant to remove that God, but sometimes I miss him. I apologize. Thank you, brother. What I love about this is, one, Paul is keeping the Sabbath. All right. What does it say here? And Paul, after this, tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren. We're going to define brethren later on in this lesson. And sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Centuria, for he had a vow. That's Torah as well. There's all kinds, like 3 major Torah portions here. So, by all means, Paul was trying to get back to Jerusalem to keep a feast. And this was most likely Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread by this time in the scriptures, most likely. So here's Paul again. And in these particular verses, there are 3 different examples of Torah. 3 examples of Torah. So tell me how we are going to eliminate it based upon the New Testament scriptures we've seen so far. So far, I don't think so. We got too much going on, for too much in our corner to say so. Okay? Anybody want to add to this?
No. Nothing over here.
Oh, okay. All right, let's move to the next slide. I believe it's Minister White's turn to read. And then Lily, Sister Lily, Sister Billy, then Brother Dave.
Okay. Acts 21:17 through 20. And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James. And all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things Elohim had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified YAHUAH and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Yahudim there are which believe. And they are all zealous of the Torah.
All right, thank you. We're going to keep reading, so we got to read some more. Let's go to the next slide and have Sister Lily read those, please.
Okay.
Acts 21:21-24. And they are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Yahudim, which are among the Gentiles, to forsake Moshe, saying they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after their customs. What is it, therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore that that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Then take and purify them thyselves with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were misinformed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest Torah.
All right, so we're going to talk a little more about that later. But let's move to the next slide and have Sister Billy finish the rest of these verses for me.
Act 21:25-26. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple, to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. Leviticus.
Okay, thank you, Sister Billy. That's good. Thank you. So here, that's funny that James is saying this in this particular verse. He says, keeping themselves from things offered to idols. That's Torah. From blood. That's Torah. From strangled. That's Torah, because it's all about dietary laws. And fornication, which is a Ten Commandment. That's Torah. It's funny. How is this? They're talking about Torah obedience here. But what's interesting is that Paul does comply with this purification ritual. And you'll find this purification process in Leviticus 14:8, where it speaks of it here. And it says, and he that is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and wash himself in water, that he may be clean. And after that he shall come into the camp and shall tarry abroad out of his tent 7 days. So if Paul thought Torah was no more, then why would he comply with this? Why would James even speak of Torah observations to a bunch of quote-unquote Gentiles, which we'll speak on later on in this lesson as well, briefly? Why would this? This is a lot in just 2 last verses. It's a lot. But it proves the point. We haven't even got past the book of Acts, and we've already demonstrated many points where the Torah was being spoken of and expected to be adhered to. All right, Sister Billy.
Yes.
Will you go ahead and read this verse for us, please? These verses.
Okay. Act 21:25-26. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple, to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them.
Okay, thank you, Sister Billy. So here, what's interesting about these 2 verses is that Torah and obeying Torah is spoken of multiple times. James is telling Paul that we've told these so-called Gentiles, we'll define that later, that they should not offer to idols. That's Torah. And from blood, do not consume blood or touch blood or do anything with blood. That's Torah. Not from strangled. That's Torah. Fornication, 10 Commandments. That's Torah. Then he tells Paul to purify himself, which is an outward demonstration according to Torah, which you can read about in Leviticus 14:8. And he that is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and wash himself in water, that he may be clean. And after that he shall come into the camp and shall tarry abroad out of his tent 7 days. This is a lot of Torah in 2 verses, right? In just 2 verses of Acts, it's a lot of Torah. And Paul is directly engaged in this. So if Paul taught, not thought, well, if Paul thought Torah was done away with, and taught Torah was done away with, then why would he comply with James' request? Why wouldn't he be so bold and stand up against James like he did with Peter when Peter was demanding, when Peter withdrew from being around these quote-unquote Gentiles when the Hebrews came to visit? That's a whole nother story we'll talk about later, I believe, in the lesson. But the point I want to bring out is that here, and I believe that's in Galatians, by the way, but here Paul did not speak up against it in this instance because it was right to do this. All right, so does anybody have anything they want to add to this?
I just wanted to add that when you see Paul making a vow here and he's shaving his head, it's because he's made something like a Nazarite's vow. A Nazarite's vow. And you can read about those vows in Numbers. In Numbers chapter 6. Right? It talks about how when you've made your vow, what you will do, and you shave your head, right? So that's Torah, just as Brother Andrew is saying. And it does say in Leviticus 14 also about shaving the hair. And in Numbers chapter 6, it mentions how when you have a vow, right, a Nazarite's vow. So that's a specific type of vow. And Apostle Paul was carrying that vow out. Okay. So I just wanted them to see that it mentions it more than once. So it's not an isolated incident, what Apostle Paul was doing. It is actually walking out the Old Testament. So Apostle Paul is definitely not against the Old Testament. Thank you, Brother Andrew.
Nope. I agree. Thank you, Minister. Let's continue our study and have Brother David, I'm going to have you read this slide and the next slide verses, please.
Okay.
And he became very hungry and would have eaten, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance and saw heaven open, and a certain level vessel descending unto him, as it had been a great sheet knit at the four corners, and led down to the earth.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. You can read those verses as well.
Wherein were all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowls of the earth. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, YAHUAH, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean.
All right, thank you, brother. So I won't go into this more detail to this particular set of verses, that which you will get if you go visit our Who is Salvation 4 lesson. This particular section is a big part of the Christians' teachings. But when you break it down according to the true, the Greek source of the New Testament, you realize that this English translation is very misleading. But for the purpose of this particular section, or this particular section of the lesson, I want us to see here that Peter is expressing his obedience to the dietary laws of Torah. So why didn't Peter and Paul, according to what we've read so far, get the memo that the Torah was done away with after the death of the Messiah? This is some time after his death. Mm-hmm. This is years, many years after. This is not no 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. This ain't 2 or 3 months. Because when Paul, and Minister White will help me with this, when Paul was knocked off his horse and shown his heirs, he didn't go straight into ministry. Mm-hmm. He did visit Peter during his preparations, but those preparations took years. Am I correct, Minister?
Mm-hmm. That is correct. Yes, that is correct.
So if it took years And years after his death, and I'm talking about more than 3 years,
Correct.
Paul had a reputation and had a lot of relearning he needed to do. And that stuff didn't just come right away. So during all that time, Peter and Paul still obeyed and adhered to Torah. So I just wanted to point this out to people, okay, that this is the case.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody want to add to this?
If anyone has any questions concerning the food laws in this particular scripture, there is a teaching called Dietary Food Laws that expounds upon this and much more that they can reference for their learning. So I wanted to point that out.
That's right, and we'll throw that into the descriptions of the video as well.
Okay.
So let's move to the next screen, please. So we can keep going in Paul's writing, to be honest with you, to prove that he never wrote the Torah away like they say he has. But that would require a complete study of its own. So I just wanted to pull out something that at least you can see that there is very strong evidence that that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
But let's move to other authors of books to read and that have said this as well. And Minister Ronnie, can you read James 1 for me, 22 through 25?
Mm-hmm.
If she's available.
She's probably on mute.
Okay.
Okay. Well.
So you're going to read Minister White?
Mm-hmm. James.
Okay.
James chapter 1. Oh, I thought I heard her. No? Okay, James chapter 1, verses 22 through 25. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. For if any be a hearer of the word, and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself, and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. But whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty, and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the word, this man shall be blessed in his deed.
These verses right here should shut everything down for the church, but they just twist it in their comprehensions just enough to blow it off. So let's talk about this on the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Those set of verses are just amazing. Think about this. To be a doer of the word, not just a hearer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, okay, if James is saying it, and James is a Hebrew, and when James is writing this, there is no other book but the Old. All right, Genesis to Malachi. That's all they have. So what word is James talking about? It can't be the New Testament, not at this time.
Mm-hmm.
So he's telling you to be a doer of the Old. So what does the Old have in it? This is what we don't think. We could be so ignorant in our thinking when as a church member, we were. I know I was. When I thought of the word, I thought, when he said this, he's talking about the New Testament. Come on, how can he? It didn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then he tells you to continue in the perfect law of freedom. So why is it the perfect law or perfect Torah of freedom?
Mm-hmm.
Because Paul says what that is in Romans 8:2, for the law of the Spirit of life in Mashiach, our Messiah through Mashiach YAHUAH, has made us free
Mm-hmm.
from the law of sin and death. That's why the law is the perfect law of freedom, the perfect Torah of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So Torah, through our belief, our faith in Mashiach, has freed us from the bondage of sin, which is death.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what James is talking about here. This is the way the church may argue this is this. They'll say, well, The word is the words that the Messiah spoke. Okay, then tell me what he spoke. Didn't he say he came to do his Father's will?
Mm-hmm.
So we already talked about that, in the previous lesson, that the will of the Most High is, according to Psalms 40 and 8, is his Torah.
Mm-hmm.
So he came to do his Father's Torah.
Mm-hmm.
A doer of Torah, not a worker of Torah, a doer of Torah. So there's no twistiness, really. But the church ignores these verses, because a couple of verses out of 1 John and James, the church just ignores. They don't bother to deal with the contradiction. Does anybody want to add to this one as well?
No, we're good.
Oh, okay. So, brother, let's see if we're going to talk about this next one here. Go ahead and read, brother, Proverbs and Deuteronomy for me. And because we're going to start talking, now we want to talk about, because he said the perfect law of liberty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the law of the spirit of life. So if you're not convinced that they were still the same, let's read these two, brother, please.
All right, no problem. Proverbs 6:23. For the commandment is a lamp, and the law is light, and reproofs of instruction are the way of life. Deuteronomy 30:19. I call Shamayim and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live.
So, thank you, brother. So, see, the first one tells you that Torah is a lamp, Torah is light, Torah is the way of life. And then Moses said, after delivering Torah to Israel, to choose Torah is to choose life. So, these are Hebrews that speak this way. And we can't ignore the fact that we cannot ignore the fact that this is the case.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
So anybody wants to add to this one? Because, like I said, we're going to keep adding some weight to this until we can't add no more. And the church can be quiet because there's just too much. There's too much in the book that they hold so tight to that speaks that Torah and covenant is eternal. Are eternal, I'm sorry.
Okay. All right.
Anybody else want to add anything?
Yes, Sister Lily wants to discuss the tabernacle and the holy place, she says.
Oh, please.
I was just thinking of how this is a great example of all the way in the book of Proverbs that it's portraying the holy place of the tabernacle. Because in the tabernacle, in the holy place, you need the menorah, which is the lamp. It's the light, and it's shining towards the truth, which is his way of life. It's just something that I wanted to point out.
Oh, that's right. I might have to dig into that tabernacle. I was talking about it to my kids this morning, how incredible is the way it's set up. And it's relevant, and as Minister White says, it's what it is. It's relevant for today in every way. So I thank you for that.
And to undo.
Anybody else?
Yes, if you remove the laws of the Most High, or if you remove Torah, as Sister Lily would say, you would have to go into the tabernacle in the holy place and remove the table of showbread. And then you would need to remove the menorah as well. You would need to remove both of those intricate pieces. Those are major pieces in the holy place. You'd have to remove both of those because the showbread sits on one side and the menorah sits across from it. And the only light that is in the holy place is the light of the menorah. So the light is shining on the bread. The ruach is shining or pointing out how to have life. Because Yahushua says, I am the bread of life that has come down from the Shamayim, right? So if you remove the laws of Yah, then you would destroy the holy place in Moses' tabernacle. So Sister Lily's point is valid. Thank you, Brother Andrew.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you. All right, anybody else?
We're good.
All right, let's move to the next one, please.
Okay.
Now go ahead. Continue with James myself. This is a short one here.
Mm-hmm.
James 4:12. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and destroy. Who art thou that judgest another? So the first thing I say to myself when I read this is, who is the one lawgiver who is able to save and destroy? If the Torah is done away with, why would James associate being saved or destroyed by the one who gives the law?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that something? Why couldn't James just say the lawless? Why couldn't James just say the giver of grace? Since that's what we're taught, that we're saved by grace through faith.
Mm-hmm.
Not knowing what grace and faith really mean, because they don't desire to look at the meanings of those two words from a Hebraic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
James did not. If the law was not relevant, why would he mention it?
Mm-hmm.
That's the point I want to make. There's so many instances like this, and they're in every book. In every book, we can point them out in pretty much every book in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Anybody wants to add to this?
If James is concerned about the lawgiver, that means that the lawgiver is the giver of laws, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't be titled as so. So everyone should be concerned about the laws that are being given by the lawgiver, and not just the lawgiver alone, but the laws that the lawgiver is putting out should be followed. Excuse me. And that's all, Brother Andrew.
That's right. That's right. I agree with you. All right. Anybody else?
No one else.
All right. Okay, Sister Lily. Sister Lily, how about you reading the next slide for us?
First Peter 1.
And you'll read the next two slides. The next two slides, please.
Okie dokes. First Peter 1:1-2. Peter, an apostle of YAHUAH HaMashiach, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, elect according to the foreknowledge of the Elohim the Father, through sanctification of the Spirit unto obedience, and sprinkling of the blood of YAHUAH HaMashiach, grace unto you and peace be multiplied. Tabernacle. 1 Peter 1:14. As obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lust in your ignorance.
Okay, let's move to the next slide, and you can read the next two for me, because they're all parts.
1 Peter 1:16. Because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy. 1 Peter 2:9. Be ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should shew forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.
All right, so we got a lot to look through on these. Okay, so let's examine these highlighted words on the coming slides. Thank you, Sister Lily. So here we go. Peter starts off with this greeting, and he says, strangers throughout all these Greek colonies. All right?
Mm-hmm.
And he calls them the elect according to the foreknowledge of Elohim. Mm-hmm. Unto obedience. All right? So let's look at these. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail because a lot of this can be picked up in the who is salvation's for. All right? That's the lesson we have on our ministry page and on our YouTube. But stranger simply means a foreigner or being from the surrounding Greek colonies. Okay? And thus, that's what we see here. The elect, according to the foreknowledge, through sanctification of the Spirit, the separation of the Spirit, unto obedience. Obedience correlates with sanctification of the elect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want people to understand that. Unto obedience. Obedience correlates with the sanctification of the elect, according to what we see here. All right? Thus, we know righteous is achieved through sanctification because that's obedience. That is what obedience is, being righteous.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's following me so far. We're going to keep building on this in the next 2 slides or so.
Mm-hmm. We're following. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move to the next one. And here, Peter again says, as obedient children. He is expressing the importance of obedience. But then he follows up by saying, do not follow after your former lust in your ignorance. So what is he talking about? Ignorant of what? All right? Mm-hmm. Let's go to the next verse. Next slide. Let's see what he's talking about. I had to add all these slides so we can get context, so we can understand. This is something that the church does not believe in doing. Grabbing precept upon precept, a little bit here and a little bit there to get the full understanding. They want you to read one verse and ignore anything that's been said previous or afterwards. Okay. We're not going to do that here, are we? So he says in verse 16, because it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy. So what is holy then? Holy is hagios in Greek, since we're talking about a Greek translation. In a moral sense, pure, sinless. Now, here's Paul talking about talking about sinless to a group of people that's supposed to be from regions outside of Israel, us a Gentile, right? Mm-hmm. But he's telling them not to be sinless in your former ignorance. That's interesting. And what is sinless? What is sinless really? It's 1 John 3 and 4. Whosoever committeth sin transgresses also Torah, for sin is the transgression of Torah. So sinless is obedient to Torah. Mm-hmm. And he's quoting Torah when he says, be ye holy, for I am holy. In Leviticus 11 and 44. Mm-hmm. So here's Peter talking about the importance of Torah by quoting Torah. All right? This is why it's important not to sit here and just take what the English translators give you. Because if you do that, you stay in ignorance and they can tell you what it means. Why do you think they have the authority to do that when they're not the original authors anyway? Everybody following so far?
Yes.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide. So now he says here, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. These Peter verses spoke of obedience, but they mentioned the following too. The elect, what are they ignorant of? They got pulled out of darkness. Mm-hmm. They're a chosen generation, mm-hmm. a royal priesthood. Mm-hmm. All right, so who is he talking about? What is all this? What is all this he's been talking about? All these verses. Well, let's see who this is, so you can know that he's really talking about Torah and Israel, even though he mentioned countries outside of Israel. Right? We saw who he was speaking to when he did his introduction in the first chapter. So let's move to the next slide and see what Paul is talking about. So who are the elect? Israel, Isaiah 45:4. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect. I have even called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. And what does elect mean? Bakir, choose, chosen one, choice one. Something that Yah did himself, by the way. So you can't sit here and throw yourself in this group. This is something he did himself. And he did it way back. All right, thousands of years ago. And in Psalms 135:4, for YAHUAH has chosen Jacob unto himself and Israel for his peculiar treasure. There you go. Peter is quoting Isaiah, and he's quoting the Psalmstress in 135:4. Everybody following me so far?
Yes, we are.
Yes. Let's continue. Next slide, please. So the elect are the children of Jacob, the 12 tribes. And in the New Testament, this is what is meant by elect, by the way. You can't sit here and tell me that, oh, now the elect are those who believe in the Messiah. Not according to the scriptures. That's not how it's supposed. That's how you want it to be. But when a Hebrew spoke of the elect, who are the authors again of the scriptures, they talked of people who were chosen by Yah himself, which was Jacob and the 12 tribes. So there is no other definition, because Peter was quoting this following verse. This makes it clear. You got to understand, if Peter is quoting Torah, all right, he already quoted pieces of it, and the prophet, and the Psalmstress, and he's sitting here quoting another verse out of Torah, then the definition for elect and the definition of the understanding of peculiar people is Hebraic, even though he's talking to people in other nations. So Exodus 19:5-6. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. This is Moses. He's talking to Moses. So by the law of first mention, the elect is Israel. The peculiar people, the peculiar treasure is Israel. And if Peter thought Torah was nothing, he wouldn't have mentioned this, because this is coming from Torah. Does this make sense? This is why I'm talking about this in so much detail, because Peter's ministry was supposed to be to Israel, but he also did a lot outside of Israel. This is one of the examples. But yet he's over here talking about the elect of Israel to a bunch of people that it shouldn't even matter to. Think about that concept. It doesn't make sense if he did that. So if you're following me, we got some more to talk about this. Let's continue. I'm going to beat this up.
Can I add something, please?
Next slide, please. Oh, of course.
Without going back to the previous slides, when Peter first began in 1 Peter chapter 1, look at how he began. In 1 Peter chapter 1, it's in verse 2. And it says, elect according to the foreknowledge of Elohim, the Father, through sanctification of the Ruach, of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Yahushua HaMashiach, right? So I want to pause there. Sprinkling of the blood. Do you realize that he is talking to a particular people because of what took place in Exodus, right? So the proof of that, you can find that in Numbers. Not in Numbers, in Exodus chapter 24. It's in chapter 24, Let me see, where is it? And verses 7 and 8. Exodus 24, verses 7 and 8. And he took the book of the covenant. We're talking about Moshe, right? He took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people. And they said, now, what people are we talking about? We're talking about Israel, right? And they said, all that YAHUAH has said we will do and be obedient. And look what Moses did. Verse 8, Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people. So First Peter is mentioning what took place in Exodus 24. It's still the same people. It's telling you right there who the people are that are being referred to. It's no other people outside of that. Okay, thank you, Brother Andrew.
And you know what? We're gonna speak. That's so true. That's why it's important to understand. You don't quote that verse to people who aren't Israel. Not only is it not applicable, but it wouldn't make sense to apply it to them. You can't apply it just free as they would say, free-nilly to anybody. It don't make sense.
Oh.
It had a particular audience with a particular purpose, right?
And remember, the Apostle Peter said that you are a royal priesthood and a holy nation, right? So this makes it, that right there narrows it down to the king's family, because he said royal. How many of us today are part of the royal family? Anybody that we know that's part of the royal family? We don't know anyone, do we? But we do know that there are very few people that are part of that family. So this is a royal family that Yah is talking about, that Peter is talking about. Yah chose this family. The family did not choose themselves. It was Yah's sovereign right to choose who he wanted to make part of his family. He says, I only chose one people, Jacob, or whom he renamed Israel. He said, I chose them. This is the royal family I want to represent me to the world. So no one else can add themselves or insert themselves into the royal family. That would be equivalent trying to insert yourself into Princess Diana's family and then claim part of her inheritance to go with it. That's how serious this is. That's how serious this is. This works the other way. Those who are part of the royal family are saying, I'm not part of that family. Not even understanding the greatest gifts if they are giving up. Gifts from the Most High. They don't understand what they're sacrificing by saying, I'm not part of the royal family. I'm not part of the Hebrew Israelites. And I'm definitely not going to abide by any law, statutes, commandments that are set out, because those are all gone away. You're disqualifying yourself from receiving your inheritance. You know how parents write their wills for their children, but if one of the children become a drug addict, what do? They write that person out of the will, right? Mm-hmm. This is the same thing. These people who says, well, I'm not going to do what it is that I'm not going to obey the terms of the covenant, of what's inside your will. I'm not going to do those things. And the parent, Heavenly Father, says, no problem. I'll just write you out of the will then. But boy, do you know what you're giving up? Do you know what you're sacrificing? You want to inherit the world, right? You want to inherit the world and lose the one that created it. This is backwards. This is backwards. Thank you, Brother Andrew.
It is. When you think of it now, you understand the truth. It's audacious. It's incredible when people reject it, but that's what they're doing. So let's move to the next slide. We're going to continue with what more Peter had to say. So, what are the elect then ignorant of? The elect Peter was writing to were Hebrews, just like we were talking, all tithe of Israel. They were foreigners. They were Hellenistic because they were part of the Greek colony. So they lived under Greek laws and they did the Greek religion. They were ignorant of Torah and Hamashiach. And how do I know this? Because Peter told them why they were called back. And 1 Peter 2:21 and 22 says this, for even hereunto were ye called, because Mashiach also suffered for us. Peter is including himself with these foreigners, leaving us an example, that ye should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in him. So if Yahusha did no sin, then they needed to know Torah. And that's what they were ignorant of. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Anybody want to add to this? Because Peter has more to say.
No, let's keep going.
All right, let's move to the next slide. I believe it's Sister Billy's turn to read, right?
Okay. 1 Peter 4:1. For as much then as Mashiach hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of Elohim.
Thank you, sisters. So, again, he's pointing out the importance of not sinning, which is obedience to Torah, is to not sin, right? But he also says that's to the will of Yah. So we know what the will of Yah is because we've read it in Psalms 40 and 8. I delight to do thy will, O my Elohim, yea, thy Torah. Thy Torah is in my heart. That's pretty much it says, I delight to do your will, O my Elohim. Yes, your laws are in my heart. So, again, Peter just keeps saying it, and he's talking to the same audience, by the way. He's talking to the same audience. It hasn't changed. This is the same letter. It's still 1 Peter. Okay. Anybody wants to speak to this one? We see that Peter has spoken to this audience who's supposed to be outside the tribes, but he spoke in reference to Torah, in reference to the elect, the royal priesthood. All these things he said cannot be but one thing, the Hebrews. And then he tells them that they should not sin. No longer are they ignorant because now they have been brought out of their ignorance through the blood of our Messiah, through his suffering, and that we should cease from sin. All of this is all Torah-based. This conversation Peter is having. Anybody want to add to this?
No, we're good.
All right, let's move to the next slide and have Minister White read this.
Okay, 1 John 2.
1 John.
3 through 4. And hereby we do know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him.
Man, we're about to get into some scriptures that's so plain, so easy. This is not complicated stuff. But boy, will the church twist and do, as Minister White say, calisthenics, to get away from what it said. So you may say you love the Messiah, but you must demonstrate your love by keeping his commandments. And we're about to prove that right in the next verse, next coming slides. Anybody want to add anything?
Keep it going.
All right, we'll keep it going. We'll keep going. So let's look at John 14, 15 and 21. All right. He says, this is the Messiah speaking, if you love me, keep my commandments. That's demonstration, not word. You got to demonstrate it. And he says, he that loveth my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me, and he that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and will manifest myself to him. That was verse 21. So here he says, if you love me, keep my commandments. If you love me and keep my commandments, right? If you show me that you love me by keeping my commandments, then my Father will love you. So love must be demonstrated. You can't tell me you love God and you don't keep all the commandments. Now, of course, we know there's a twist to this for the church. They'll say the Sabbath is no more like it used to be because he's Lord of the Sabbath, and I can keep it any day of the week now because I love him, and I keep I Sabbath with him all week. That's a bunch of baloney, of course, because that's not scripture. You don't just do whatever you want with something that God has ordained and set rules for. That's one of the workarounds I've gotten from people. So most of the stuff you see in the church is done out of repetitive ritual, used to doing things, of behaviors, without questioning the behavior. But here we see that John is speaking on the importance of the commandment, and that love is conditional. And the commandments are nothing but the summation of Torah. Anybody want to add to this?
I was just going to say that for those who are mathematically inclined, they might notice that John 14, 15, and 21 are they're actually if-then statements. They would know that that's a math statement. If then this, then you would get the equal that, or you'll have another if-then statement. So these statements are, they depend on another variable, right? They depend on something else taking place, and that is the commitment of the individual. If you want to get something from the Father, you're going to need to give him something in return. That's like the law of reciprocity. But we're used to the idea in church of extracting from the Most High and not having to give anything, and not having to give our commitment back to him. He's just, we've been viewing him as a genie in a bottle. We can rub the bottle, make a few wishes, and then we can confess our sin, and then we will believe that he's faithful to forgive us because we confess it. But even though we continue to do it, right? So these are if-then statements, and to receive the love of the Father is going to require, or actually demand, demonstration on your part, on all of our parts. Thank you, Brother Andrew.
That's right. That's right. I completely agree with you. So let's continue. Matter of fact, Minister White, I want you to read from the next two slides. All right, we're going to go to Revelations now.
Okay. Revelation 14, 9 through 10. And the third angel, and the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of Elohim, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb.
All right. Next slide, please.
Okay, Revelation 14, 11 through 12. And the smoke of their torment ascended up forever and ever, and they have no rest day nor night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of Elohim and the faith of YAHUAH.
All right. Thank you so much, Minister. So look at this. The patience of the saints. They say patience, but what I love is real definition because it correlates with something else too. Patience is hupomone, hupomone, and it means steadfast, endurance, steadfast, waiting for. So the patience is the victory the elect of YAHUAH has been waiting for, the ones who obey his commandments with faith in Yahushua. So this right here requires obeying Torah, the Ten Commandments. Now, what I like about this patience, it also correlates with the definition of faith according to the Hebraic definition. So this proves to me that the Greek writers could have picked a better word for faith when they translated, because this hupomone lines up with the true meaning of faith, which is emunah in Hebrew. And that word is steadfast, steadiness, loyalty, fidelity. Sounds very familiar to this Greek word hupomone, right?
Yes.
So he's really saying here is the faith of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments and the steadfastness of Yahushua, the loyalty to Yahushua, to Yah's living word. You can't get around it. So Torah and the law is even relevant at the very end of things. And I want to move before anybody comments on this, let's move to the next slide, and I'll read the last verse in Revelations 22 and 14. So blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life, and may enter through the gates into the city. So here we go at the very end. Torah, Ten Commandments are spoken of during the end time. Without obeying these, and I mean obeying them to the fullest, from physical and spiritual, because that's where most of the church fails. They do a lot of the physical. They don't steal. They don't cheat. They don't murder. They don't commit adultery. Some don't. Some aren't fornicating, commit adultery, all that type of stuff. They say they have one God. They say they don't have idols. They say they don't take his name in vain. And they believe the Sabbath is any day of the week. They think this, right? When in fact the church pretty much breaks them all. And you can learn that through our Ten Commandment lesson we also have on the House of CeeLo Ministries YouTube channel as well. Like I said, we'll have those linked to this lesson, because this lesson is the culmination of all of things. Okay? So anybody want to add to what we've spoken on in Revelation?
I have a comment. We just made on the Sabbath. Yeah. I've heard that Sabbath should be any day of the week, but it cannot be any day of the week, because the Book of Jubilee tells us that it's the most holiest, most Kodesh day of the week. So if it's the most Kodesh day and the holiest day of the week, then how can it be any day? Because the rest of them are not Barak. The other 6 are not Barak, like Sabbath is. So how can it be any other day? It can only be the day he set, because he sanctifies that day. The other 6 days are not sanctified. So that is not true. And if you had a birthday that was coming up and a person wants to know when to celebrate it, they would say, okay, I can celebrate any of those 7 days. He's only born on one of those days, not all 7. The Sabbath is just for one day, not all 7. Not all 7, just for one day. The other 6, it is not the day.
Also, when you read Revelation 22:14, it clearly stipulates that unless you are a doer of the commandments, then you have no right to the tree of life. How will you access the tree of life and live contrary to the laws of Yah? That's an impossibility, right? That's an impossibility. I've heard people, because I used to say it in the church also. When I was in the church, I used to say, well, no one could keep the commandments, right? No one can keep them. No one can live a life without sin. You know how that is a cliche? It's a cliche. It really is. Because think about your job, right? How many average, on an average, how many days are you given in a year to take off for sick leave?
A week.
About maybe 7 days or 5 days in a year, right? So can you say that nobody can come to work every day, and not use those 5 days in the year? Or maybe you'll use 2 or 3 of them, right? But out of those 364 days in a year, you were there. Maybe scratch 3 of them. So you can be at work every day, and on time too, by the way. Every day, right? Pretty much. I mean, you may be 5 minutes late or something like that. On time, you're there, and you do your job every day, but you cannot keep the 10 Commandments. No one can keep those. It's a cliche, and I think the church needs to get rid of that and begin to look at it as your duty, your commitment to the Most High. It's one more thing. It's like saying that I'm married, but that other girl, I ain't gonna tell you I'm not gonna sleep with her now. Maybe, we've been together for 10 or 15 years, and I'm not going to at least 1 or 2 times have an affair. I won't say that. Would you marry that person? You wouldn't, right? Even if it were the woman. Especially if it were the woman. If it were the woman saying, honey, I love you, but Bob has muscles, so somewhere down the line, a few times in our relationship, I'm only going to do it maybe 3 times, and that's it. Do you think that your husband would accept that, even if it's just 3 times out of the 10 years you've been married to him? So we should not say that no one can keep the laws of Yah. We should not say that. We should get rid of that. That's a cliche. So that's the point that I wanted to make, Brother Andrew. Thank you.
Those are good analogies. That's a really good analogy. Because we can say we can come to work, and we know people have done it. Mm-hmm. And no one wants someone that won't be completely faithful. That's doable too. It's simply a choice.
Yes, it is.
Simply a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move to the next screen, and we're going to finish this.
I want to speak about the rest of the sentence there. I want to speak on the rest of the sentence. And may enter into the gates, into the city. Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life, and may enter into the gates, into the city. So, if you're not keeping the commandments, how do you enter into the gates, into the city? How do you get into the kingdom of Yah? According to this verse, you not keep his commandments. According to the scriptures, any other way in is defeat.
Yep, and that's something you can see in our lesson too, Kingdom Come, where it describes the ministry, the true ministry of the Messiah, and what the kingdom is, and who are the citizens of the kingdom, and how you gain entrance. And it speaks of that very importance. You have to wear Torah. You have to be in Torah to even enter the kingdom. You won't get it any other way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can I add one more comment, please? When you look at this scripture, verse 14, what you're looking at is a recipe You're looking at a recipe. He's saying, when you do the commandments, then you'll have access to the tree of life, right? And with that, you get into the gates. Why is that important? Because to get into the gates of the kingdom, you have to be alive. You understand what I'm saying? You have to be alive to get into the kingdom. In order to be alive, you have to eat from the tree of life. In order to eat from the tree of life, you have to obey the commandments. And those who do not are considered dead. And you can find that in Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9, verse 60. And YAHUAH told them, let the dead bury their own dead. What was he referring to? Those who are outside of Torah are considered dead. And when you come into Torah, then you're beginning to eat life. You have life. Nothing that's dead can enter the kingdom. Does he not say flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom? So you need something more than what you are right now to be able to get in. And the food, the recipe for that is the commandments, right? Obedience. Then you receive the right to eat from the tree of life. That is going to change you. And then you'll be able to enter into the kingdom. Other than that, he says everybody outside the kingdom, he gives a list of those who are outside the kingdom, right? He talks about the dogs are outside the kingdom, right? So there will still be people that are alive on the earth who are not in the kingdom because they're dead. The dead cannot enter the kingdom. And without obeying the commandments, you don't have access to the tree of life. You can't get in. It's a recipe for eternal life. Take heed. Thank you, Brother Andrew.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I appreciate the details. Those are things that we need to see, putting the spiritual understanding of the scriptures into our daily lives that we just don't think of. And we're definitely not taught to think this way in the church. So we're gonna finish this section up now. Let's move to the next slide and just talk about the summary, what's to come next July.
Okay.
So, in summary, we went through from part 1 through part 6, all of this. We went through a lengthy examination to prove the covenants and are eternal. We demonstrated just through what we finished up that Torah is eternal. We also demonstrated that Torah is required in the New Testament as well. So since you know that Torah and the covenant are eternal, what is the next truth you need to seek then? I believe that is who are the true people of Israel. That's important. Why? This will tell you who the covenant belongs to. This will tell you who the Torah was given to. This will tell you where prophecy is today, which is very important. This will tell you who will be impacted by prophecy going forward as well. And that's why we need to understand who the people are so we can understand where things are at and what's about to happen. So since we talked so much about Torah, I wanted to make sure that the audience knows that there's a very thorough lesson on the relevance of Torah at the link here listed. It's also on our website, House of Shiloh Ministries, and our YouTube channel as well. So the next Shabbat, we're going to begin our second truth. We've been discussing just one of the truths. Now we're going to begin our second truth. Who are the true people of Israel? And one of the first things we're going to discuss is who is not, which I think is very important because the world has got the biggest scam in the world right now. The biggest theft in the world right now is what we see in Israel today. All right? So we thank you all for joining the House of Shiloh Ministry and experiencing this lesson through the first 6 parts. We thank you so much for enjoying the Sabbath with us. Please join us again as we continue this lesson where we talk about the history of Israel. Shalom.
Also, it's important for you to know if you are a part of Israel as well. And that's because soon our Messiah is coming. And the scripture says his reward is with him. Do you want to receive your reward? The reward can be good, or he can be rewarding you for your sins. Either way, the reward is coming. So if you're a part of Israel, then you want to stay tuned to learn what is it that you stand to inherit by being obedient to the law, statutes, and commandments of the Most High. So stay tuned with us. We look forward to fellowshipping with you again in person or via YouTube ministries. Shabbat Shalom.